Assalamu alaikum. Today we're going to talk about the idea of conspiracy theories. We're not going to talk about like conspiracy theories as a big concept. We're just going to mention this, that in today's dialect, in today's dialogues in societies, we tend to dismiss somebody saying like, well, this was a conspiracy by such and such vested interests to do this. People say, oh, you just believe in conspiracy theories. Well, a conspiracy by itself, if you look up the definition of conspiracy, it's like when two or more parties, there could be individuals, there could be nations, there could be corporations, whatever, gather together and do something to achieve a certain purpose, and usually through subterfuge or through hidden means to some degree. And that's a fact of life. It's been happening throughout human history. So, when somebody says something which is sounding conspiratorial, it should not be dismissed just because it sounds conspiratorial. It should be rather looked at into whether there's some truth to this or not. I'm just going to give a couple of examples here to show you how conspiracies have been very common and things have been happening. And again, I'm not picking these examples out of some very weird sources. These are just well-known examples. Back in the days in early 1900s in America, you had the city transport networks, kind of tram lines, kind of train/tram lines within cities. And what happened was that as the car companies were increasing in their output, and they wanted to create new markets for their products, especially buses, trucks, cars, so on and so forth. One of the things they did, so in particular GM, General Motors, it created certain front companies, small companies that are supposedly interested in running the tram lines or the transportation networks within different cities of the United States. And so this company went around buying these from various cities and municipalities or other operators and bought these, and then once they had bought these, instead of keeping those networks running, they start slowly dismantling various parts of the network under the pretext of like, well, this part of the tramway line goes to a neighborhood that's not well that's not well populated, it's not profitable. We're going to dismantle this part of the network and put some bus lines there. We're going to run buses. Now keep in mind, these companies were owned behind the scenes by GM, and GM makes buses, but GM was not making tramways. So over time, over a couple of decades, this process of replacing transportation network within cities of America by bus lines and also by encouraged use of the automobile by individuals was accomplished by a process that was conspiratorial, because the companies that bought this thing, were front companies and controlled behind the scenes by GM. So, I mean, that's a conspiracy right there. And this is a fact. You can look it up. There are many books that have been written about this. Similarly, along those lines, more recent times, you have the late 90s in California, the California Air Quality or Air something board that regulates how the pollution into air takes place. It started enforcing and requiring car makers to start producing more and more electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. And yes, car companies in compliance with this started creating electric cars. But the companies were not willing to stick with it for a long time, so they start going to work right away, where they started putting pressure on the California Air Quality Board, and they try to buy their way through it, through influence, through connections, through money. They started creating a counter narratives, and so what they did was a couple of things just to mention. Most of the electric cars, if not all, were sold under a special agreement where the company reserves the right to buy back or demand the car back from the individuals that had sold the electric cars to, because they were not planning to have this as a long-term project. They were just doing it initially to comply, and once the conditions were favorable to them politically, they wanted to just take these cars back, and then thousands of cars were destroyed and crushed, and because they wanted to erase this thing. Because why would they do that? I mean, weren't these their own products? Yes, but once you get into details, electric cars don't require as many regular maintenance, because what you have with gasoline based cars, you need oil filters because all the gunk that comes from the gasoline, you need the air filters, you need the lubrication done, you need the lubrication oil change every time because it gets heated up, burnt up over time. So there's a lot of auto parts industry that goes with the regular gasoline cars, which is much smaller with electric vehicles. So car companies in the longer term stood to lose money, and they decided this is not in their favor currently at that point in the late 90s. So they started creating counter narrative. They said that electric cars are not as good as the ideal hydrogen powered car that this will come around sometime in the future. So one of the ways they were able to dismiss their own product of electric car was to talk about the hydrogen powered car. And eventually when the car companies had bought their way enough influence and they had created enough allies in the California Air Quality Board, that Californian board reversed its own decision and didn't require the car manufacturers to anymore abide by the certain regulations they had set up before. So now the car companies had a free hand. They started calling up the owners to whom they had sold these cars. They collected them, crushed them, and got it out of the picture. Small side episode in there was one of the companies owned by GM bought a battery company that was owned by a professor from California. His name was Ovshinsky. So this guy was always like inventing new batteries and all these kind of things. So they bought one, battery company from there. But then they, along in the process of buying the battery company, they bought the patents to a certain number of his batteries, which were for electric cars, thereby holding the patents and stifling innovation and killing off the innovation that company was doing. In another example of a process that was conspiratorial, and if you were to describe this process, there was things being done in the front, things being done on the back side. There were multiple parties involved. They had certain interests that were not being revealed on the front side, and it fits the textbook definition of what is or dictionary definition of what is a conspiracy. And there are many examples one could bring from modern political stories, old political stories, monarchical stories, this, and we can just go on in many fields, scientific domains, political domains, economic domains, and so on and so forth, companies, corporate domains. So these are, as we say, everywhere. So when next time somebody is giving you a description or a detail of something, how something happened, don't just dismiss it because it sounds conspiratorial. Evaluate it. Yes, there are plenty of goofy sounding conspiracy theories too, but if there's evidence and then it's been well documented, then don't just dismiss it just because it's conspiratorial. Hope you learned something from today's lecture.